unlike almost all anti-war post-service veterans, in which I have to include myself, Matt did something courageous in uniform or in government service in his case, which is refuse and dissent publicly. And like it's been said, a dissident is action, not words. And Matt was a combat vet Marine before he went over to the State Department, and then found himself on the front end of the Obama surge, right? The good war. And I'll let Matt expound on that, right? But that's what we were told. And I believed it along with half of America, right? When you were getting ready to go to Afghanistan with State, I was coming out of the surge in Iraq thinking, this guy is the future. And, and I bought it. And I think a lot of us did. But Matt, you stood up and said no. And in that sense, like Giovanni, you showed courage most of us don't have. And like I started with, I think because of that, not just in the veteran community, but especially, you've stood as an example and an inspiration that you, of course, will reject for a whole bunch of us, because you were anti-war like a few others when it wasn't cool. I'm not sure it is yet, but Matt, thanks for coming on, and you tell us what's on your mind, brother.
Thanks, Danny, and it's great to be with you guys, as well as of course, to be on this podcast again. You guys are doing great work, and Eric, that was a really beautiful piece of writing. Put a little bit of a tear in my eye. I mean, you feel like you've heard so much of it so often, and just the way it's phrased differently one more time, gives you that sense of feeling again. And, the other thing too, so many of our paths have crossed, whether we've known it or not. Eric, you were at Arlington National Cemetery. I lived across the street on the other side of Route 50 from Arlington Cemetery in Fort Myer for years. I used to drink with guys. I was overseas, I guess, when you were there, but I would be drinking with guys from who were part of, the old guard at Fort Myer, in this dive bar that was on Pershing Drive right there. I remember, and so much of us cross paths with one another, whether or not we know it or not, and then meet up later in life. But the other thing too is that I think for most people who are not in the military, their conception of Memorial Day as a veteran is that you're thinking strictly of your lost comrades, the guys and gals that were you with, they're no longer alive, and that it's just limited to the people in uniform. And certainly, as we've heard today, it's not. Memorial Day is not limited to just men and women who wore the uniform. Every one of you guys so far had said, have mentioned the Afghan or the Iraqis. You've mentioned family members. You've mentioned, so this extends out in waves and in ripples that I don't think is well understood outside of the veteran community, and not said well enough either. It's not expressed well enough that, look, Memorial Day is just not about the men and women that we are burying who used to hold a rifle. This is about the families, and you can expand this to so much, whether it's the families who had to bury people, whether it's the wives who are living with extremely high rates of domestic violence in the veterans community, right? I mean, like, there are wives who are suffering because of that, or the men and women of veterans who have PTSD, or the spouses or family members who now have PTSD themselves because they lived with somebody who went away and came home not themselves. And now they walk on eggshells around them. And now they themselves have PTSD because they're trying to be a caregiver. They're trying to be a loving spouse or brother or sister or mother or father or son or daughter. And it just wrecks you. I mean, and then, of course, all the people in these countries, too many to name, I mean, if and Danny and I had a piece today in together in Mother Jones, and we expanded on this a bit and spoke about it. But this idea of what the war means to other people outside the United States is something that we don't come across enough and don't discuss enough, and not just for the Iraqis and the Afghans, but all the wars. Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and then all the wars that have torn apart Africa over the last 10 years. People who are living, whether because militia groups have, and insurgencies have banded with extreme Islamist groups, or because the United States is providing tens of millions of dollars and green berets to dictators and despotic regimes, or it's our drones flying overhead that are terrorizing a generation of people. A generation of young people from Mali all the way to Pakistan are growing up afraid of what's in the sky above them. And, so this idea of Memorial Day and what it means, it's certainly different than the first time I celebrated Memorial Day. I went into the Marine Corps in January of '98. So Giovanni only asked me in terms of being the guy who's longest in the tooth here. But, so this is like 22 years for me of having something to do with Memorial Day because I was in the Marine Corps. I was part of the, the service. And it definitely has changed. And I want to say that this year, I think I'm the least angry I've been in a long time. I think that has a lot to do with the coronavirus, because the coronavirus has cut out a lot of the typical or normal conversation you usually have about Memorial Day. But on the other side of that, I think, and this is again is something that Danny and I spoke about in our piece, this idea that those who went overseas from the United States, the people who were most represented in terms of those who suffered and the families that suffered because of these wars here in the United States, are largely unseen. They largely come from rural populations or urban centers. They largely come from certain parts of the state. I know Danny is doing work on this, and I know he's got stuff coming out about what it looks like in terms of who in New York went to war, fought, and died. And like it's that type of understanding of demographics. And as most of us all know who are there, there's a poverty draft. It's economics of most of our kids who, gals we served with came from lower income families. And we see that now, I think, with what's happening with the coronavirus. And I think this is the point that Danny and I were trying to get at, is that the people who are suffering and dying from the coronavirus are for a large part from the lower income, are from communities of color, and that they are unseen, that they are unknown. And so I think, getting at that, it comes to, well, we call these people heroes. And so whether you're a kid who ended up going to Iraq and getting blown up and killed, or whether, you're a mother who's working, her shift in Walmart because she needs the money, we call these people heroes. But the reality is that they're exploited people. And, the thing I think about with Memorial Day is that it should be about moving forward. Of course, it's about remembrance and all that, but it should be about moving forward. And if we're going to tie this coronavirus into the wars, and if we're going to say that the war on COVID, and we're going to make these allusions to the Second World War, well, then at some point we have to understand that, well, then change must happen. Something must come from it. Because otherwise, if this war on COVID is going to be like the war of our generation that you guys have all been speaking about, that this podcast is more or less devoted to, well, then, it's going to be a 20-year, this war on COVID, this pandemic war is going to be the same in the sense of that it's going to be a failed war. It's going to be nothing will change. The pandemic will win. As well as those who benefit from the pandemic, just like as those who benefit from the wars have won, so to speak. There's been a lot of people in the United States who have won from these wars. If you go to Washington, D.C. in the suburbs, around Washington, D.C., that's the wealthiest part of the United States. And it wasn't the wealthiest part of the United States 20 years ago, but it's the wealthiest part of the United States now because of how much money we spend on the military, the war making machine that exists. If you go through any of the Washington, D.C. suburbs, they are just completely populated by the defense industry and the intelligence industry, and then all the other organizations that support that. So there are a lot of people who are making six-figure salaries, who have 2 homes now, who have done very well because of the wars. And the same will be the case with the pandemic. And so I think that and I know Danny began this with talking about the veterans community and the anti-war community. We have to engage on this in the sense that, look, when I first got to Iraq was right in 2004, was right at the time that Rumsfeld had said along the lines of, look, you don't go to the war with the army that you want, you go to the war with the army that you have. Well, you know what? We go to the pandemic with the healthcare system and the society we have, not with the one we want. And so how different is it for me and the guys I was with in Iraq? If I used to get in my Humvee in Iraq in 2004, and I used to have this armored door that the guys before us had made, right? And I close that thing and I take a hammer and I drive a peg, right? To keep that thing secure. And it really didn't matter because from here up was open. So yeah, maybe the lower half of my body would have survived, but the top half of me would have gotten swiped away. But how different is that, right? Than these nurses and doctors, these heroes, right? Hey, I guarantee you what, as soon as sports comes back, guys, instead of us being asked to stand up and be applauded at every game and that whole awkward thing we go through, that's going to be now nurses and doctors. But how different is it for me having to use that jury-rigged armored door of our own, and all these doctors and nurses who we call heroes dying doing their work, who are making their own masks, gloves, who are going into work with aprons from their kitchen to use as smocks. How different is that? So I think that, with every Memorial Day, I do try and not look back so much as I want to look forward. And I think as a community, for those of us who are on this call, for those who are watching and listening, that this is something that the anti-war community really must engage in. We talk a lot about intersectionality, right? We talk a lot about, and we say all the time, look, as an anti-war movement, we have to reach out and explain to the environmental movement that, look, hey, as long as ExxonMobil, its biggest client, is the Department of Defense, there's going to be no change in any type of, right? There's going to be no progress on the environment. Just as the same with, and the same with the labor movement, the same with whatever other movements that militarism really weakens. So I think that's it now as this pandemic goes on, as 100,000 are dead, and I think this is the same with a lot of you guys feel the same way maybe about, I know I'm here in North Carolina, everything's reopening, people are going to the restaurants, nail salons are open. I've got the same feeling in my stomach that I did when the surge in Iraq happened, the surge in Afghanistan happened, the airstrikes in Libya occurred. We started arming fighters in Syria, right? We started building drone bases in Africa. The same feelings in my stomach that this is not going to work, this is a huge mistake, are there. And I think as veterans, we do have a place in society where we can be heard. And I think this is where we really need to make because I think this is just one more thing, along with the wars and along with climate change. This is the triad, if you will, these pandemics, and I believe more will come, are what really will cause so much more suffering, if not the collapse of society, end of human race, etc.
Matt, thanks so much for that. We need to do more articles together, and we need to do more calls to come up with the article ideas, because you genuinely have a real gift for like the linkage and the analogy in a common sense way, because even just now listening to you, I was like, man, I wish I would have come up with that and wrote that. So we'll have to
feel free, man. You're recording this, so you should get a transcript. So feel
right.
free, dude. Yeah,
Perfect.
yeah.
And like our last transcript, it turns out that we both say, a whole lot, especially me. But I mean, I think there it is.
There it is. Exactly. Yeah.
You brought up so many important linkages about society and how the pandemic does in real ways, not in like the veneer ways that we often hear, relate to these wars. I think that is super vital to bring up, because if there is a silver lining to Corona, it seems to be like the gift of exposure. And I don't mean that as a pun, in the sense that I'm always asked, and I'm sure you are more and for longer than me, well, what do you do? How do you make people care? And of course, there's already a pejorative in there that, the implication people don't care, but largely it can be true, although they have their reasons living paycheck to paycheck. But the thing about that I try to say is, well, we need to convince folks of the truth, which is that there are opportunity costs to military spending and war. And I think, like you mentioned, the way that the nurses are running into these underfunded hospitals without PPE, just like when you and I were in Humvees that weren't good enough. And during the EFP craze in East Baghdad, the projectile, piercing rounds, for someone got the idea that glass, like the plexiglass, would stop it more than the metal. And so then there was like all the replacement windows in the whole base in Southeast Baghdad went missing because everyone was stealing them and just like tacking them inside their door.
No, don't get me started. We used to, I was a combat engineer, and in Anbar, we didn't have, and we had terrible snipers out there for a while, and our guard towers didn't have the bulletproof glass. And so my guys used to have to go to the dermo lots. In dermo, if you don't know, is where you put decommissioned military equipment. So my guys have to go and the guys who are building these things would go and, the ones that weren't out doing route clearance, looking for the IEDs, were building these bunkers and guard towers. And, they would basically pull the glass out of the Humvees to put in guard towers. And I mean, I could go back, and I mean, if I went back to the website iCasualties, which is which tracks and lists all the people killed in these wars, and if I went back to 06, 07 and looked at the names, I sure as hell would remember which of those were Marines that were killed in guard towers because we didn't have glass there, right? But as we used to say, we can't get glass for our guard towers. Our Humvees aren't adequate to protect us. But, if you went to the air base, they've got a Burger King that I bet never runs out of buns. I mean, so it all depends on what type of, I don't want to get down on the path of talking about the money involved and everything, but yeah, no, absolutely. This is the exposure. And I think touching on what I said about not being angry, this is also too, though, I feel as if the least I've been contacted about Memorial Day by friends, family, acquaintances in a long, long time. Right. And I think that's because, people aren't being told, to excuse that phrase, but it's not being suggested to people about Memorial Day this year as much as it has in the past, because I feel in previous years you get like those text messages and emails that mean well, but you could tell this person obviously just heard something and they're reaching out to me to thank me for a service because they were told to do it. They're conditioned to do it. It's become like a religious ritual, basically.
Absolutely. And it has been an interesting experience. And like we mentioned in the piece, if you exclude the world wars and the Civil War, more people have now died of coronavirus than all the rest, right, of our wars combined, Americans at least. And that's instructive in a sense. And I think we hit some interesting parts of that article and the way you linked it to the unions and the war on labor, because this really is all connected. The last thing I'll say before I do our best to keep it on time and turn it over to Henry and Clifton is, I'm glad you brought up, because we have done a great job on this pod, as I knew we would, of mentioning, the locals in these countries and the suicide and the PTSD, and that's not done enough. But you mentioned the dependents and the sacrifice and the trauma that they go through, the wives, of these soldiers who go away, or husbands now. Yeah. And, it resonated with me when you said it, because personalizing things has its limits. But I mean, look, we all like to be the protagonist of our own stories. I mean, I walk around every day with my headphones on because I like to think there's theme music to the heroicism of my life. But the reality is that I broke 2 marriages with wonderful people.
Yeah.
And and I have culpability for that. That's far outside the veteran experience, but there's no way it didn't play in. And then when you multiply that by the millions of Iraq and Afghanistan vets, it's like no one really ever buys. Well, they wouldn't know in the first place, but no one like buys a ticket or a Friday's meal for a dependent who's there like alone and struggling with her. Like you've seen her, right? With like the 4 kids and 2 of them are under the age of 3 trying to get on an airplane. I mean, that's a logistical nightmare worse than getting out of Iraq. And we've all watched them. And so I just think it's really important that you brought up the dependents, and I'm glad you did.
Well, it makes me laugh actually thinking of that, because I remember when you'd be overseas, you'd be deployed, and guys would go home on R&R for 2 weeks, and they would be grateful to be getting back to Iraq or Afghanistan, because the home life was such hell, because, right, with all the kids there and everything else, and what the wives were going through, and the honey-do list was longer than their arm. And yeah, I mean, like I remember, but I mean that, but to get back to the serious aspect of it, oh yeah, I'm the same way too. I've got, I wrecked the marriage, I've wrecked relationships, and I think everybody who's gone through this has some aspect of that. It's only the very few lucky who haven't, whether it's because they got engaged early in therapy and help, and also too that they've got a spouse who understands so well, to the point that the spouse is also getting help, because the spouses can't get through this on their own, and so many of them do. And the other problem is too is that it's just the way that it works, that somebody, you fall in love with them, you're making a life with them, they go away for 8 months or 12 months or however long, and they come back, and say they're a different person is understating it. And then everything that comes from with that, the anger, the depression, the substance abuse, all those other things that come along. Yeah, life becomes a living hell for so many spouses and children. And I say it's not just our generation. I mean, you certainly talk to people who have fathers who were Vietnam vets. You talk to people who had whose fathers were in World War II or Korea. The same things occurred, and it's something I think our society just doesn't speak to enough, about how much these, it's men and women, but it's predominantly women carry, and how that affects them in terms of having you getting that secondary PTSD.
Absolutely, man. And Tim O'Brien's great piece, The Things They Carried, listed all the metaphorical stuff. And someone needs to write a things they carried for like the wife at home.
Yeah, geez.
If she carried a lot.